Right. Thank you both so much. It's really just a pleasure to be here. It would be much more fun to be in person because I have had the opportunity to come to Duluth a few times actually for this wonderful Celebrate Night Sky Week, but Zoom will do for now. So I want to say thank you for the invitation to participate. I'm really proud of the work that's happening in the Great Lakes region. For all of us, it makes life much more beautiful when we can see a beautiful starry night sky. So as you heard from some of that introduction information about me, I am what is a self-described star lore historian. And that is a title that I made up for myself in order to describe and keep open the many different avenues that we can take to get into the night sky and to really honor and acknowledge that every culture has a star lore. And it's our inability to see the night sky is interfering with our ability at a certain point to remember what's coming out of the very diverse cultures that have all developed a certain star knowledge that has informed everything from civic practice to agricultural practice to ceremony, you name it. It was rooted in an attempt to understand our relationship as human beings on the earth with the stars. And so celebrating something like equinox, because the equinox just happened a few hours ago. So I'm assuming all of us in the Northern Hemisphere. So now we're entering into the season of greater outer darkness because the sun has crossed over the celestial equator and now the daylight begins to wane. And we no longer live in a time when there are people just standing on the earth and looking into the environment and reading what's happening among the planets and the sun and the moon and the stars to figure out where we are in the cycle of the year. Now we get information about the fact that it's equinox from something like the International Celestial Reference Frame, which astronomers use to measure extragalactic points, to their radio signals, to determine what is the relationship between celestial bodies. So no longer is it a human being standing on the earth. It's not even something that's within our planetary system, but measuring points outside of our galaxy in order to say, now is the equinox moment. So what I'm hoping we can do tonight is look from the human-centered place, from the human being on the earth, looking out into the sky and having an imagination about what our relationship is. And when I use the word imagination, which I use a lot, I don't mean just make believe. It's more that we use our intellect in order to understand the sense perceptible world, the world that we can see by the light of the day or even by artificial light. But imagination is the kind of cognition we need for things that are beyond the sense perceptible world. So for instance, gravity is not sense perceptible. We can see the consequence of gravity, but we can't see the force of gravity itself, or the wind. We can see what wind does, but we don't see the wind itself. So we have to enter into imagination if we wanted to create an inner picture about what wind is or might look like, although that might sound crude. So that's what I'm speaking about when I say imagination. And I'm going to start sharing my screen so that we can take this journey together. So let's see. I'm going to press. All right. Unless I see a message, I'm going to assume that you can all see that, although hang on just a minute. I have to do something before I can. All right, here we go. All right, so starting first with Plato, who was a classical Greek from classical Greece in just, I think, 3rd century BC, or like 1st century BC in like 300 or so. He wrote something called the Timaeus, which is a dialogue in which he discusses the things of the physical world, but also the relationship of the human being to the universe. And it's in this particular piece where he has his character Timaeus speaking to Socrates about the human being. And he says that he's discussing the creation. And he says, after having made it, the universe, the great creator being divided the whole mixture into souls equal in number to the stars, and assigned each soul to a star. So there is this ancient belief that every human being comes from a particular star. So not just you had a particular sun sign in the zodiac and horoscope when you were born, but that there is a star from which you hail on your way coming toward earthly incarnation. Also, this is different from saying we're made of star stuff. We have the same elements in our being that that we would find in the stars. And the idea about this, very much abbreviated, is that a star will go supernova and it casts its elements out into space. And over long periods of time, these elements can coalesce and we begin to experience life as we know it in this combination of elements. But this idea coming from Plato is different than that. It's that as a soul spirit being, the human being originates not with the earth, but with a star, and that every star has a soul connected to it. And so that as we come toward the earth, we kind of carry this relationship to this star. So then Plato goes on to write, and having there placed them, each soul, in a chariot, he showed them the nature of the universe. So he's kind of just giving this picture of how the soul is united with the star, and then this creator being is showing the workings of things in the universe. And then he goes on to say that after the human being has incarnated on the earth, that after, if you have lived well during your appointed time here, then you return and dwell in your native star, and there you have a blessed and congenial existence. And so this idea is really dominant in ancient cultures, that every human being comes from a star. After living for a while in the physical realm, then when you die, you go back to your star. So it's not a star that's gone supernova, which wouldn't be there anymore. It actually still exists. And so there's something really lovely, I think, that we can imagine happening at the equinox time, when our star, the sun, the star that we all share in common as a humanity, begins to wane in our sky, so that we're not seeing it as much as we will now see the moon. But this picture was taken over Lake Michigan last night, which is where I am. I'm in northern Michigan, not in the Upper Peninsula, but northern lower Michigan, looking west over Lake Michigan just as the sun had set. We had a really dramatic show of sky for the last few moments of summer. And so what I'm imagining is what was happening in ancient cultures when they were celebrating something like the solstice and the equinox. Everything that was happening in the ceremonial celebration was clustered around these really significant moments when it appeared that the sun was either highest in the sky or furthest below and there was greater darkness, or at these points of equal day and equal night. So the word equinox is rooted in two Latin words that I'm not going to try to pronounce, but it translates as equal night. So what will happen for us in the Northern Hemisphere is, if we were to watch the sun where it's rising each moment, each day, or every day throughout the cycle of the year, we would see that part of the year is sweeping toward the north, and then it gets northernmost, it will pause. That's the summer solstice moment. It's like a mighty out breath. All of the earth forces are reaching up and out. Everything is blossoming in the Northern Hemisphere and reaching sunward. And then from that moment of summer solstice, there's this pause, and then this in-breath begins, and the sun seems to set now degree by degree further south along the horizon until it gets all the way to its southernmost point. And then again, a pause, and that innermost point is the winter solstice. But halfway between those two, that summer solstice and winter solstice, we come to this moment of autumn equinox, when day and night are of equal length. There's not really a pause that happens the same way at the solstices. But if we do take this analogy of our own breathing, if everybody were to just breathe in and then breathe out. I can't see anybody's faces, so I don't know if you're doing this with me, but I'm just going to imagine, because we all breathe, that you have a sense that when we breathe in, there is a natural pause. And when we breathe out, there's a natural pause. So this breathing cycle is something that we share in common with the earth. Now, the earth in its breathing is not doing it like 18 times a minute the way the human being is, but it seems to be related, you could say, to the precession of the equinox points. So right now, when the sun comes to its autumn equinox, as it did today, it's in front of the stars of Virgo. At the opposite time of the year, when the sun comes to its vernal equinox point, it's in front of the stars of Pisces. Now, it used to be that the sun was in front of Libra at autumn and in front of Aries in the spring. But because the earth is doing three things, it's rotating on its axis, it's orbiting the sun, and it's wobbling. This is causing a slight shift in our relationship to the stars. So over time, the equinox point precesses through the stars. So right now we have autumn equinox when the sun is among the stars, or in front of the stars of Virgo, the maiden. So the reason I wanted to put this picture here was to just give a sense that this is like the sunset time of the year. The sunlight will be waning now. We're entering into greater darkness. And so our star And by our, I mean all of humanity, or particularly all of us in the Northern Hemisphere. It's as though that sun is going to sleep, and no longer is it calling the forces up out of the natural kingdom. All of the leaves are starting to turn and fall earthward. The fruits have ripened and they're hanging heavy down toward the earth. The animals begin to make ready for their hibernation. But something unique happens with the human being, and I'm going to get to that in a little bit. But what I want to suggest to us is that at this time, if we hold this imagination that each of us comes from a star, which is just a really, really beautiful thought. If it seems too wild and you don't want to try it on, you don't have to do this, but just to imagine what it's like when it gets dark outwardly, because our sun is not as present in the sky overhead, that this is the time of year when the light that we must follow that can guide us through the dark is actually the light of our own star. You could say that it's the star of your soul spirit being. And to the extent that you've cultivated an awareness of that, that is the kind of light that shines into the dark that we enter into now at the equinox time. So this moment described as the time when the sun will rise due east and set due west. It's right over the equator of the earth. So this is this earth-sun relationship. What I'm also imagining is that there's a sun-star relationship, but it's to the star of each individual. So it's not just one star that's in the region of Virgo that happens to be where the sun is right now, but imagining if I were to be able to find my star, where would it be? And that this is the season when I can become aware of that. And then to be like a star, which is to say that the stars, apart from our sun, they shine through the dark, but they don't diminish the darkness. So we can follow a star to find our way and to get direction, but it's not about diminishing the dark to do that, because in the dark is where the imagination lives and where things can be really enlivened. So while outer nature seems to be falling asleep and going dormant in this season that's now just begun with the autumn equinox, this is actually the time when the human being awakens within. And also, just to get back to this idea about the precession and the breathing process, that the earth is wobbling on its axis, and this wobble takes 25,920 years. This was figured out ancient ages ago. But what that means is if you were to divide that number of years by the degrees of a circle, you would find out that every 72 years, the earth has wobbled 1 degree of the zodiac. So this 72 years figures into some really interesting mythologies, particularly in the ancient Egyptian culture, in the story of Osiris and of his birth. And it's told to his mother that she was unfaithful, and it was prophesied to her husband, the earth god, that if she should ever have a child, that he would lose power. So he never wanted her to have a child. And when he found out that she was pregnant, he cursed her. And he said, "You shall give birth in no month and in no year of the Egyptian calendar." And so she had a friend in Thoth who was gambling with the moon, and he won the 72nd part of every day from the moon. And when he had 5 full days together, he placed them at the end of the Egyptian calendar. They belonged to no month and to no year. And during that time, then she could give birth. So first to Osiris, then Seth, Typhon, Nephthys, and Isis. And so this 72nd part of every day that Thoth is winning away from the moon seems to suggest that the Egyptians were aware of this wobble happening with the earth in its relationship to sun and stars. But the fact that it takes 25,920 years is the thing that really excites me, because on average, the human being breathes 18 times a minute. There's 60 minutes in an hour, 24 hours in a day. And that means that we breathe in every 24-hour cycle 25,920 times. So this is a literal microcosmic rhythm inside this much larger macrocosmic rhythm that the earth is exhibiting. So our breath in relationship to earth breath, full out breath at summer solstice, full in breath at winter solstice, and then these equinox moments, which are not so easy to find in our breathing, like when am I halfway through the in breath? But that's where we are in the cycle of the year. And as I said, what I'm imagining at this point is that the sunlight is waning. We will actually have greater moonlight during the winter months, the fall and winter months, and we will have sunlight. But as that sunlight is waning, our own starlight begins to shine. So now is our journey to our star. So now I'm going to get into the star tales of Mother Goose just for a moment because I can't help myself. This is a map that comes from the end page within the book. So we've taken the entire night sky, and rather than spread out the constellations that would appear around the north celestial pole, we put them up so that you can see them in relationship to one another. But what I like to point out at this is that there's always 5 things overhead that never set below the horizon for us in the evening sky. And that is a king, a queen, 2 bears, and a dragon. So hopefully you can see them without my pointing at them, because I'm using a MacBook, and when I get into my screen share, I lose the ability to use my mouse. So no pointing for me. But you'll see Cepheus the king. He's right up there at top with Cassiopeia, his queen. And then below them, you see Ursa Minor, which is the little bear. And then further below that, Ursa Major, which includes the asterism of, well, it's the Great Bear, but includes the asterism of the Big Dipper. And then snaking along between the dippers is Draco, the dragon. You'll also notice that the very ungainly Camelopardalis is also in the circumpolar region of the sky. That's the region of stars that circle around the pole star, but they never set. But I don't usually include that when I'm describing this region of sky, because that's a constellation that was created only after the 1600s in the age of exploration. So this is a time when the scientific revolution is well underway. The idea that the Earth is not fixed immutably at the center of the universe, but is now in motion around the sun, has already taken hold. And the explorers are finding constellations or patterns over the southern skies where they're traveling, where they had never been before, that are now the race is on to like create new constellation patterns in skies that were seeing for the first time, but also then to, when they got back home to the north, to look in places where there seemed to be gaps where there were no constellations and create some. So these kinds of constellations are not rooted in this idea that each of us comes from a star, and that the constellations are so named and so organized in the thinking of a person who holds that belief according to what is the characteristic or the gift that I'm receiving from that region of sky, those divine spiritual beings that inhabit that particular region where I see that pattern of stars. So no offense to Camelopardalis, but it's not one of those constellations. So I don't include it in my 5. But you're free to do whatever you would like there. But I really just want to talk about what's going on there. Because so we have the king, we have the queen, we have the 2 bears, and we have the dragon, and they're circling around every single night. And now, right now, today, well, what you're seeing on this map, the straight line that's going through the center, that's the celestial equator. It's just the Earth's equator projected out into the stars. So that straight line, if you were to lay this map over the Earth, you would align it so that that line goes right over the equator of the Earth. And then the curved line is called the ecliptic. And so even though we know that we are moving, and this is our concept, we can conceive of Earth motion, but we can't really feel it. We can see that the sun rises in the east, it goes overhead, it sets in the west. It looks to us like it's moving, but actually we are rotating on our axis toward the east. That gives us the sensation of the sun's motion. But if you were to chart the course that it seems like the planets, the moon, and even the sun are making around us in the cycle of the year, you would get that curvy line there. That's called the ecliptic. So today, the sun is right here, right at the point where the ecliptic crosses the equator, and we call that equinox. So our star, the sun, is, you could say, illuminating the northern hemisphere as much as it's illuminating the southern hemisphere. But now it's going to go into the southern celestial hemisphere, and we in the north are going to miss it. We're going to have less sunlight in the north. Now, 6 months from now, when we get to the end of March, the sun is going to be coming across that celestial equator, coming north on the ecliptic in front of the stars of Pisces. So Pisces and Virgo stand exactly opposite each other in the sky. And so these mark the equinox points where day and night are of equal length. And I have been suggesting to us that when we've got the sun on the top part of the curve in the northern celestial hemisphere, that's when we have this kind of day-wake consciousness where we're using the intellect to understand with logic and reason, the sensible world that we can see. And then as the sun sets below that celestial equator and it kind of hands off its light so that we now have to find our way through the light of our own star, now the imagination begins to stir. So I'm going to introduce you to the world of the star tails of Mother Goose. So now just kind of zooming in on one region of the sky. This is not what we are going to be able to see tonight because the constellation Virgo is where the sun is right now. So the sun is illuminating that part of the sky, but we can still see Boötes and Arcturus, which is bright star Arcturus. But just to give you a sense, that's where the sun is. Virgo is kind of leaning over right there on the path of the ecliptic. And then here's Boötes. So the star Arcturus, which is the brightest star in the constellation Boötes, is one of the brightest objects in the night sky. So if I don't talk too long and you have the opportunity to go out after the sunset, the brightest thing in the west is going to be the planet Venus. But then not too far away from that, and also very bright, will be the star Arcturus, which is in this constellation Boötes. And then also, one of the ways to find your way to Arcturus and to know that that's the star you're looking at is to be able to identify the Big Dipper, which is more to the north, and you follow the arc of its handle, and the arc arcs to Arcturus. So this is a way to constellation hop from one place to the next. And then also from the Big Dipper, if you follow the two stars on the outside lip of the cup of the Dipper, they point right to the North Star. And so that North Star belongs to the tail and so you've got these constellations that are above the region where Virgo is. So the sun is illuminating Virgo, so we're not going to see that tonight, but we'll see Boötes, we'll see the Big Dipper, we'll see the Little Dipper. And these are, the Dippers are both belong to this region of sky that never sets below the horizon. It's called the circumpolar constellations. They circle around the pole star. Now Boötes, for us this far north, is a constellation that will set below the horizon. So it's not, technically it's not circumpolar. But it's really important to us when we look at this particular star picture because Boötes is sometimes described as the bear herder. So Boötes will herd the bears around the North Star. But this is a really interesting job, bear herding. And also these are really interesting bears because they seem to have really long tails. So not like bears that we have on the Earth. But if we start to look at the star names, that of the stars, not just the constellations, but the stars themselves that are in the circumpolar region of the sky, we start to find out that they have a lot to do not with bears, but with sheep. So the second star in the handle of the Big Dipper has the name Alioth, which means the fat tail end of the eastern sheep. And several of the stars in the region of Cepheus the king have to do with flocks and wandering sheep or lost sheep. There's also a shepherd star there. So that makes me imagine that Boötes, rather than being a bear herder, is a sheep herder. And rather than being a male sheep herder, he might in fact be a female shepherdess with the name Bo Peep. And little Bo Peep has lost her sheep and can't tell where to find them, but leave them alone and they'll come home, wagging their tails behind them. So this is a way to imagine circumpolarity because Bo Peep is told in this little ditty, don't worry about it. They're going to come right back to where they started from. They're just circling around the North Star, wagging those big tails, which are more easy to imagine, I think, with sheep than they are with bears. So this is just a way to use a Mother Goose ditty, a little rhyme to kind of build a ladder toward the sky without using something like a telescope or astronomical units, but really just to have a playful imagination. You don't necessarily need to point this out to a child, although Mother Goose rhymes are considered children's rhymes. It's just a fun way to kind of access some of the things that are happening in the night sky. So little Bo Peep has lost her sheep and can't tell where to find them. Leave them alone and they'll come home. That's the circumpolarity, wagging their tails behind them. So this region of the sky, I think, is also connected to another Mother Goose nursery rhyme, which is Sing a Song of Sixpence. Don't read that yet, which I've put up there on the right-hand side because that's a little poem that I wrote about it. But it gets a little bit more dramatic when we get to sixpence. So sixpence is, I'm going to try to recite it without singing it. Sing a song of sixpence, a pocket full of rye, 24 blackbirds baked in a pie. When the pie was opened, the bird began to sing. Wasn't that a naughty dish to set before the king? The king is in the counting house, counting all his money. The queen is in the parlor, eating bread and honey. The maid is in the garden, hanging up her clothes, when along came a blackbird and nipped off her nose. Okay, so everything in that ditty is also it's possible to imagine it in the night sky. So the king, if you look at the star map, is the constellation Cepheus. So Cepheus is the king, and his counting house, we could imagine, is the Milky Way. So you see that he's right there on the Milky Way. So that's his counting house, and all the stars there, that's his money. So the king is there in his counting house. He's counting all his money. Next door to him is Cassiopeia, his queen. She looks kind of like a sideways W. She, excuse me, she's upside down on her throne in this image. And the honey that she's eating from the honey pot, I imagine, is coming from the beehive cluster, which is at the heart of the constellation Cancer. So if you look on that ecliptic, that really pale white line that's going through this map, you'll see Cancer there. And there's a little circle indicated right at the center of the constellation. That's the star cluster M44. And it also has the name beehive cluster. So we imagine the king in his counting house of the Milky Way, the queen getting honey out of the honey pot, out of the beehive in the region of Cancer. And then the maid is Virgo. So she's right there on the ecliptic, which we imagine as her clothesline. So she's there hanging up the clothes. And then underneath her, if you follow the arc of the Big Dipper's handle, it arcs to Arcturus, and you speed onto Spica. And if you keep going, it points right to Corvus, which is the blackbird. So all of the characters there, the king, the queen, the maid, the blackbird, the clothesline, the honey, all of those things are in the evening sky. Not, again, not at the season, because we can't see Virgo right now. So this would be earlier in the summer. But also that little ditty is a way to get into the sky. Now, birds being baked into a pie is actually a reference to something that used to happen, particularly in the French court of Louis XIV. And it was something that was called the entremets, or an entertainment dish, where a pie shell would be baked separate from the top of the shell. You would put live birds in it and then put the top over it, and it would be served so that when you cut the pie open, the birds would go fluttering out into the dining hall, and everybody would be really wowed by this fantastic bit of pastry that was being offered. Also, there would be these really elaborate fountains, and sometimes there would be plays and things happening in between the different courses of the meal. So this is what an entremet is, and this is what is being referred to about 4 and 20 blackbirds being baked in a pie. But also, I imagine that there's something quite powerful happening in this region of the sky that is referred to in it's chapter 12 in the book of Revelation, where there's the being John, who's the writer of the Revelation, is saying, "Behold, a wonder in the heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, the moon beneath her feet, a crown of stars on her head, and she's laboring to give birth." And there's also another wonder there. He sees a red dragon, and this dragon is waiting to devour the child as soon as it's born. And then this great battle breaks out between the archangel Michael and his host of angels against this dragon and his host of angels, and they're defeated and they're cast down to the earth where human beings have to deal with them. But it's possible, I think, to imagine this region of sky in that story, because we've got Virgo, who's like that divine feminine being. At this time of year, she is clothed with the sun, although when that book of Revelation was written, the point of autumn equinox would not have been in front of the stars of Virgo. So just want to say that, but that right now we do have it's like Virgo is clothed with the sun in this season. And when the moon passes through this region, you can see it goes right underneath Virgo. So it's as though she can stand up on that moon. If she were to stand on the moon, then the constellation there next to Boötes that doesn't have a name, that's the starry crown. So you could imagine that that would appear on her head. But as soon as that starts to happen, that uprightness, what you can imagine then is that the Hydra, the serpent underneath, who's kind of in that dragon family, begins to undulate and begins to move. And so then Arcturus with Boötes in this imagination becomes the mighty archangel Michael that does battle with that serpent. So this is the way I've imagined it in the second part of the Star Tales of Mother Goose. So interesting thing about this book is that Mother Goose nursery rhymes are definitely designed for children, but children of a certain age, it's not necessary to teach them about the night sky. They're still living in the world of very rich imaginations. And my experience has been, although there can be precocious children that are really interested in looking at telescopes and knowing things about the night sky, we don't want to call a child out too soon away from the earth and be sending them back off to the star, especially if you have this idea that we just came from your star. So it's like, you got to hang out here for a little while. But the second part of the book then is more geared toward the adult, where you've got the history of where do these Mother Goose nursery rhymes come from? Who is Mother Goose anyway? Where does each one of these rhymes first seem to appear? Plus star maps to show you how to find the constellations that are connected. And a little ditty that I wrote for each rhyme. There's 10 traditional Mother Goose nursery rhymes. And I'll just read out this one, which I've just explained, that makes a reference at the very end to this woman of the apocalypse. So with our days 4 and 20 as the sun takes the sky, there are those who will use it to simply make pie. The king in his house counts his money so bold. The queen in her parlor spreads her muffins with gold. And the maiden, she's busy, the sheets for to fold. But what's hidden there in this scene so sweet is the thing that can happen with a moon at your feet. Then the maid rises up, wearing the crown of the sky, placed among kings as the dragon goes by. So this is just a way to imagine the stories that we have coming out of our very deep, rich cultural practice, and then also the constellations that we see in the night sky. I'm not saying that this is exactly what's going on there, but just trying to tease out of the cultural context a relationship, a connection. Is this perhaps what the writer of this great book of Revelation was seeing? Is this what the great writer of the Mother Goose nursery rhymes was imagining? Like, where is this coming from? And does it fit for me to think about it that way? And if it doesn't, I have to leave it behind, but I've published a book about it. So I think some of it does fit. So also now I want to take a look. Let's see, we're going to move on from that one. So I want to look at Virgo again. How the Hydra there is underneath the maiden Virgo, and in the description that comes in the Revelation, it says that the dragon, let's see, the dragon drew 1/3 of all the stars from the sky. And so the Hydra actually moves underneath 1/3 of the stars of the zodiac. So its head is underneath Cancer. Its heart region, where you have the star Alphard, is right below Leo with the heart star Regulus. And then the kind of the midsection, which in the human being is kind of from the chest down to the pelvis, which is in ancient astrological tradition, is the region of the human being that is governed by the constellation Virgo. So that would be like the midriff, the midsection, and that's where the Hydra has the Corvus, the blackbird, and Crater the cup sitting there in that midsection. And then the tail is just beneath Libra, which is the scales or the balance. And so it's really interesting to think about a story that comes, for me at least, that comes out of ancient Greek culture that has to do with the origin of the seasons. So the Greeks imagined 4 great ages of humanity on the earth. So there was the Golden Age, the Silver Age, the Bronze Age, and the Iron Age. And they got progressively worse as they went on. So in the Golden Age was under the governance of Kronos, who was known to the Romans as Saturn. And during this time, it was just eternal spring. Everyone lived in happiness. All of their needs were met. There was no need to toil. There were no insects. The weather never changed so dramatically that one had to seek shelter, and everyone lived in kind of this endless bliss. But then a new order of gods came, and that was the Olympians. And the Olympians led by Zeus, or Jupiter to the Romans, and they overtook the old gods, the Titans. And now Zeus, he started to impose this division of this eternal spring, so that human beings then had to start to work. They had to start to farm the land and domesticate animals. So the spring was shortened, and it was followed by a hotter season known as summer. And then came the fall, when everything was ripening, and then into the winter when things got really cold. So now human beings, again, they had to build shelter. They had to dig in the soil. They had to do things that weren't happening in this age of the old gods. But what they forgot to do during this time was to offer sacrifice to the gods. So Zeus got really angry about this, and he wiped out the human race, but then reinstituted it in what became known as the Bronze Age. So it goes Golden Age with Saturn, Kronos, Silver Age with Jupiter, Zeus. Then we get to the Bronze Age. And this was described by the ancient Greeks as a really crude and cruel time, full of violence. No one was farming the land. They were going around doing acts of violence. And this was a period of time that was not really desirable to be a human being on the earth. So then again, Zeus wipes out the race of humanity. And then we come to the Iron Age, which is actually described as the worst of all. And there's one particular divine being that stays with humanity through all 4 ages, from the Golden Age through the Silver Age, through the Bronze Age. But when we finally get to the Iron Age, this being has to leave the earth because she can no longer tolerate man's inhumanity to man. And this being is the goddess Astraea. Her name, she's the goddess of justice. She's a daughter of Zeus and Themis is the goddess of law. And Astraea is also the sister of modesty. And so she's regarded as the most kind and gentle of all the gods. And she's usually shown wearing a mask so that she's blinded. So there will be no prejudice or no bias one way or another when she's exercising or handing out justice. She carries the scales in one hand and she has a sword in the other. But again, not a sword as a weapon, but a sword of justice. But during the Iron Age, she fled the earth and she went up into the heavens and there fell asleep as the constellation that we know as Virgo. All right, so this is where the sun is today at the autumn equinox in this region of stars where we have Virgo the maiden. She's sometimes connected, this constellation is connected with Demeter, who's an agricultural goddess. I've connected this to the woman that's just the maiden from Sing a Song of Sixpence and to the woman of the Apocalypse. And now we're talking about her in the Greek culture as the goddess Astraea. And the prophecy was that she would go there and sleep and stay in the heavenly world and the starry celestial world until humanity had righted itself, and then she could return to the earth. So there is a prophecy about her return. But it's interesting, her attributes, not only is she blindfolded and carrying the scales and the sword, she always has as a protector for her a lion. So when we look at the star picture, we can see that the lion is Leo and the scales are Libra. And then Astraea herself is the constellation Virgo. And it's possible to imagine that Boötes is carrying, it's not drawn on this map, but Boötes is oftentimes shown carrying a staff that could be like the sword. It could be like the sword of light that Michael wields in the story that comes out of the Revelation, but it could be the sword of justice that becomes available to Astraea when she's there. She's off asleep in the autumn sky. Excuse me. All right, so this is a story that's connected with this region of the stars and with this Iron Age of humanity, which I don't know if we're still in that Iron Age, if it was something that was going to extend until the time that this woman, this goddess Justice, would return from the stars. Something to think about at equinox when we are in this time where the sun is moving through that place and we seek to find the balance. All right. So another story that's connected to the practice that happened at this time of year that comes out of the ancient Greek culture. This is a statue of Adonis. Now, Adonis was born from a tree, and he was considered the most handsome of human beings, loved by both males and females. And he was so beautiful that Aphrodite put him in a chest to protect him and gave it into the keeping of Persephone, who's goddess of the underworld. And Persephone fell in love with him and didn't want to let him go back to Aphrodite. And so Zeus had to send Calliope to set up, to organize a way for them to share Adonis. And so what she did was she divided the year into thirds. And she said that Adonis could be on his own for 1/3 of the year. He would be with Persephone in the underworld for 1/3 of the year. And that then he would be with Aphrodite for another third of the year. Well, Adonis really liked Aphrodite. So he took the 1/3 of the year that he had to himself and combined it with the 1/3 that Aphrodite had. So we ended up with these, you could say, like 2 seasons. One when the sun is in the underworld, where this brilliantly handsome being is in the underworld with Persephone, and then 2/3 of the year when he's in the upper world with Aphrodite. But what would happen as a ceremonial rite in the time of the year when the sun is going below the celestial equator, and everything in nature is, as I said earlier, it's going dormant. The leaves are falling from the trees. The plants are starting to wither. The animals are getting ready for their hibernation. There would be a ceremony of taking a statue like this of Adonis and wrapping it in a funeral shroud and burying it in the sea. And then everyone would go through a period of mourning for a length of about 3 days. So weeping and wailing that there was the loss of beauty, the loss of vitality and youthful vigor and everything that is fertile and belongs to the time of year when the earth is blossoming up in the spring and everything is in full growth. But then after 3 days, the statue would be extracted from the sea and a great celebration of resurrection would ensue. And so what was being indicated, what we think, what researchers suspect was happening in this particular mystery of Adonis, was that the human beings understood at that time that when outer nature seems to go to sleep, that's when the inner nature of the human being awakes. So even though things get dark and cold at this time of year, and we're going into greater darkness, into greater cold, this would be the time of year when that inner light, that inner star begins to really become inflamed and it fires forth, and that there's more activity within the human being, and it's a much more alive and awake time of year. And I'm thinking that since I'm speaking to folks in Duluth, you'll probably agree with me that this is a great time of year because we don't live this far north if we don't like the cold. So this Adonis festival would happen around the time of the autumn equinox. So a great morning when it would seem like all of that fertility and vitality was being buried, and then it would be resurrected after 3 days, and then there would be a great celebration about the life forces that the human being carries within the self. So this transference, you could say, from the light of the sun to the light of our own star, which is really only something we can experience if we go seeking it. It's not just a given that you're going to know which star is yours or how that might operate. And maybe this is the first time you've ever heard such a thing. So just watch what happens now that you've heard it. All right, so I think that that might be close to my last slide. This is a poem from Emily Dickinson, and I really love this because of the way she indicates a relationship to the stars that has nothing to do with what we might consider astrology or trying to predict what's going to happen in a human biography based on what's going on with the stars. Certainly, this was something that was widely practiced in ancient cultures. The astrologos, the star word, the speaking of the stars, was something that is exhibited as a belief during the time of the ancient Egyptian culture. We still see it in artwork during the time of the ancient Greeks. But then when we get to the kind of after the beginning of the Christian era and the introduction of the scientific revolution and the idea that the earth is in motion, then this astrologos, or this astrology, gives way to the astronomia. So this body of knowledge about the physical properties of the planets and the stars. How far away are they? How can we measure their orbital rhythms? And how can we determine what might be the chemical composition of their atmosphere or what's at the core? So these are things that have to do not with whether or not there are divine spiritual beings that inhabit the planets and the stars and that have as their interest what's happening with the human being on the earth. It's more now about the physicality of things, and that this astronomy or astronomia would eventually give way to an astrosophia, a star wisdom that is able to glean both from the astronomy and the astrology that precede it, the wisdom that the human being needs in order to relate harmoniously with the environment where we find ourselves. So how do we live in a way that we're making conscientious choices that are that demonstrate that we're aware of our effect and impact on our habitat? So for instance, when the birds are in their heavy migration like they are right now, what are we doing in our environments that can help or hinder that? How are we making use of our energy resources? When we hear things like from the statistic from the International Dark Sky Association that almost 1/3 of all the light that's used across the United States each night is being wasted because it's spilling up into the sky where it's not needed. It's costing us over, I think, $3 billion a year. And how are we demonstrating our sensitivity and our ability to live in a healthy way in relationship to our environment when this kind of thing is going on? And then also, we do know that exposure to artificial light by night, especially, but also I think overexposure to artificial light during the day can have an effect on healthy human circadian rhythm and also on healthy sleep patterns. So when we've got sleep disorder, we've got illness, because sleep disorder is connected to every major illness that plagues our population. So we've got this, the consequence of our use of light is really affecting habitat, energy resources, our own health and well-being. So protecting natural darkness is not just, it's not about trying to get back to an astrology or even just to practice astronomy or just to be able to see the stars. It's really about being better stewards of the environment in which we find ourselves, which includes the celestial environment that surrounds us. So all of that to get back to this poem by Emily Dickinson. Go thy great way. The stars thou meetest are even as thyself. For what are stars but asterisks to point a human life? I see that I made a typo there. It says to paint a human life, but it's actually supposed to be to point a human life. And what I love about this is, as a star lore historian, when I'm looking for cultural context in relationship to something that's happening in the stars, there is oftentimes something will be happening, like a great conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter, like happened last year at winter solstice, that kind of calls out and says, look right here. It doesn't say, here's what you're going to find. It's just right here might be a spot that you would like to look. So something is indicated in history that's being pointed to by the stars. Just like you could imagine, or I like to imagine, my own star is kind of pointing towards something that eventually I might see. Ideally, I will see it. The closer I can live in harmony with the earth and its processes, and aware of my kind of the beating of my heart, the rhythm of my breath in relationship to the beating heart of the earth, and the earth's in breath and the out breath, just this beautiful embrace. And then Virgo itself, which is where the sun is at autumn equinox, is oftentimes drawn as a woman holding a child, or holding a shaft of wheat, an ear of corn, in this beautiful cloak embracing her. And the cloak has all of the constellations of the zodiac on it. And so as we have later and later sunlight, and later and later sunrise, and earlier sunset, it's like this cloak is just enwrapping us. So really, really beautiful, being held by the stars. I think of this as an imagination that belongs to this time of year with the autumn equinox. And excuse me. There was one more slide I had in case anybody was interested. This is just my contact information. Mary Stewart Adams. I have two websites, The Storyteller's Night Sky, where I post my weekly radio segment and different articles and things that I've written, and then also starlore.co, not .com. Got to pay the big bucks to get the .com, but starlore.co is where you can get information about the book, The Star Tales of Mother Goose. So I'm going to stop my screen share, and I really, really hope that there can be some conversation. It doesn't have to be about anything that I shared. I would love to hear from the folks that have joined us here online about, any questions you might have about other stories, or something that you'd like to share. That's the better part of this for me, is to hear from everybody else.
All right. Thank you so much, Mary. Just loved your talk, and learning so much more just about some really interesting star stories.
Yeah.
I
go too fast.
no, it was great. It was great. We definitely want to encourage anyone to post questions, messages in the chat, and we will certainly relay them, or Mary can certainly read them herself too, if that's easier. But to start us off, I had a couple thoughts that was, as you were talking, I thought it was really interesting, and this is more of a comment, but just your connection of, as we head into this like season, which so often winter is thought about in a negative way, in so much darkness, and there's so much more talk about the things that go along with that. And so I guess my comment is more focused on just the amazing way that you can turn that around, and thinking about your own starlight, your own personal light. And I just thought that was a really good reframing of such a great time of the year, especially with equinox today and in fall. So
yeah, thank you. I mean, I think it's really important to kind of shift those ideas that we have, and particularly because the winter months are when we have like great stargazing. We're not looking into the thickest region of the Milky Way, which we get, at the end of August. We're looking into a star field that is not as heavily populated, and the quality of the dark seems to be different, but it can be so glorious. I mean, there's no other word to use. And so we really shouldn't be bogged down with, oh, it's going to be too cold. It's like, no, you can get out really early. I mean, in December, you can go out at 5 o'clock in the evening to see the sky, so you can do some early stargazing. And just this idea, like, I mean, when I first heard this idea out of ancient cultures that we each come from a star, I was like, whoa, like what a thought. And if it's true, it's got to be knowable, right? So then how do you find out? You just got to start like, you just got to start out like, I'm just going
Yeah.
to find out, like either they were wrong and I'll figure that out, or they were right and we've forgotten.
Mhm.
So that's the kind of quest I like to go on, and I'm still on it.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's definitely something that doesn't just end, for
Yeah,
sure. So,
yeah, yeah,
well, I've got another question here, and actually maybe a couple more, but I'm very curious about kind of the start of your passions, and kind of how they developed into what they are today.
yeah. Oh, that's a good question. So I'll have to start with saying that I guess I was 18. No, it starts before that. I remember standing next to a horse fence with my mom. I grew up downstate. We had 20 acres and there was a horse farm next door. And we were out leaning against this fence, and she had this plastic bowl that had a thing fitted inside of it. And it had the horizon on it, and it had hash marks that indicated the time of day and the months of the year. And she could move that part of it to show what constellations we would be seeing overhead. So just kind of remember this moment. And I don't have anything really romantic to share about the feeling. It wasn't just like, oh, I have to do this. I just remember that moment. But then when I was 18, I picked up an astrology book, and I was reading about Saturn. Like Saturn means responsibility, and Saturn is father time. And so it goes through this astrological definition of what the planet Saturn is. And then if it's in one region of the sky, it's nuanced a certain way. If you move it to another region, it's nuanced a different way. And I was like, living saw puzzle. You just, if you put the thing here, you put it there, you just got it. There's like this enduring definition, but it just gets tweaked a little bit depending on where it is. So it seemed like a really easy thing to figure out to me. And then, so I would just play around with it, not because I wanted to predict the future, but it was just really fascinating to me. Now, all along this time, I'm studying English literature in college. That's how I got my degree in. But over the years, when people find out that you know astrology, they're like, wow, you read my chart, right? So I was now probably early 30s. I had several kids, and my daughter walked into the room, and gosh, she had to have been about like 6 years old. She said, "Oh, well, Mom, what are you doing?" And I had just a star chart on my table. I was looking at somebody's horoscope, and I said, "Well, honey, I wanted to give this like really age appropriate answer." I said, "I'm reading the story of somebody's life the way it's written in the stars." And she said, "Ah, you're cheating." I said, "What do you mean I'm cheating?" And she said, "You need to be out reading the stars." She was like really little. And I was like, wow, wow, you're right. Because I don't know what the constellations look like. Like, I know what it means if Saturn is in Aries, but I couldn't go out and tell you whether Saturn is in Aries right now because I couldn't identify it in the sky. So I folded up those astrology books and got an astronomy map, and then started to learn observational astronomy. And some other things happened along the way, a lot of deep study in spiritual science and encountering ideas about the cultural history and events that happen in humanity, and star configurations that would be taking place at the same time, not in a causal way. And I just was like, gosh, I want to, like, I want to know all this stuff. I want to do all of this. So I'm reading fairy tales to my kids, and I was still doing some astrology, but mainly focusing on the astronomy. And at a certain point, all of these things just kind of crashed together. And I realized that in traditional cultural tales, a lot of it is code speak for what's understood about a relationship to the stars. So I started just hunting. I started looking in everything for the stars, whether it's the rhythm, it's the age, it's what's living in a name. And it's taken a long time. I'm 58 now, so it's been 40 years of like amassing this. I'll just call it information on this quest to figure out, does it have something to do with us? Does it matter that it's going to take Mars 2 years to go around the sun, and it's going to be in this place when it's doing its retrograde? Like, what is that? It's really cool because it gets close and it's really bright, but is it something else? Is it Parsifal after he's slayed Ither and he's put on the garb of the Red Knight, and he goes to the Grail Castle and blows it because he doesn't ask the question, and then he's got to go wandering away and face this dragon, which is like the serpent Hydra that's got the cup sitting right on its back. It's like there's all this story going on. Obviously, I get really excited about it. But so that's it was a combination of things. Just seems like it was happenstance. But when I look back, I can see, oh yeah, I was aiming at this the whole time. But how to be not, it wasn't really about being an astronomer or even about being an astrologer. It was about being a human being in relationship to the stars. So I hope that hope that was a good enough answer. It was a long one.
Definitely, it was a great answer. Um, it looks like we've got a question from Carolyn, who's wondering if you still do astrology as well.
I do. Yeah, I do. I have to be asked though. I don't advertise it anywhere. And sometimes a person will have to ask me many times because there's something sacred about that. It's almost like we have to ask ourselves, what do I want to know? What do I seek? I feel like the stars bring an affirmation into life. But also there's this story of King Acrisius of Crete. He had a daughter, Danae, and he wanted to know when he was going to have a son. And so he went to the oracle to find out, when am I going to have a son? And he found out something he did not want to know, which oftentimes can happen if you try to look too far into the future. In Dante's Inferno, he has the astrologers. I can't remember in what level of the Inferno they are. And all of their heads are on backward because they tried to look too far into the future. So they're being punished by having to look backward. Anyway, yes, I still, I don't know if I'm going to end up there. If I stay in Dante's world, and that's probably where I'll land. But I like Dante a lot. It's 700th anniversary of his death this month. But anyway, so with Acrisius, he finds out from the oracle that not only is he not going to have a son, but his daughter will have a son that will slay him. Like, this really scares him, right? So he puts her in a vault in the earth, and he like cuts her off from anything that can have, no intercourse with anything on the earth, but he leaves it open to the stars above. And Zeus he sees her, transforms himself into a shower of golden stars, and he rains down upon Danae, and she gets pregnant and then has Perseus. Right. So this is like this beautiful story about, there's a lot in there. This shower of golden stars. This is an ancient Greek depiction of this idea that we each come from a star. It predates the Christian idea that there's a star that shines over the birth of the Christ child, or Julius Caesar and the comet that appeared when he died. Like, there's always looking for these signs in the heavens. And so I do that too. I go looking like, what's happening in the world? What's happening in the sky? Like last year, I can keep rambling on, but last year it was amazing. At the beginning of 2020, there was news coming out of like, okay, there's this virus thing going on. But there was also, in the world of astronomy, there was a comet that was being watched in deep space telescopes, and it was assumed that it was hoped for that it would become a great comet, which would mean it would break into naked eye visibility. And comets are named for the person who discovered them, or in the 21st century, for the telescope array that discovers them. And so the telescope array that discovered this particular comet has the acronym ATLAS. So this was called Comet Atlas. So Atlas is a giant. And in ancient Greek culture, he's the one that is holding the pillars of the heavens on his back until Hercules comes along and he wants to get the golden apples. And, so this great story. But at the same time, the star Betelgeuse, which marks the right shoulder of the giant Orion, went really dim really quickly. And it's not unusual for Betelgeuse to dim, but it was just happening much more quickly than it had been experienced before. So there's this really interesting, I think, story happening there, where you've got the shoulder of the giant kind of slumping down as Comet Atlas is coming in. It seems to be sounding out like, humanity, get ready. You're about to be given the pillars of the heavens, right? Like, you're going to have to bear the weight of this yourselves. If you look back at 2020, you can say, oh, wow, like the gods just did that. They gave it to us. We got to figure it out. So just to complete the story, Comet Atlas broke up when we got to the end of March, right when things were starting to lock down in the United States. Betelgeuse regained its brightness, but Atlas broke up. But on the same day, Comet Swan was discovered. And it was like, oh, yay, maybe we're going to have a naked eye comet. But then we get to the end of May, that comet broke up. This was around the time of when George Floyd was killed. And that was all the headlines that were going on. And then there was another comet Neowise, which finally like picked up the baton and broke through into naked eye visibility. We were seeing pictures of it when I got on, and you had some screenshots going by. There was beautiful pictures of comet Neowise. So, I mean, these were mighty signs going on last year as we were going toward the great conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter. It's just like, wow, there was all this stuff. We don't have anything that intense this year. So, it's like, settle down. It's equinox. It's a day of balance. Things are going to be all right.
Nice. And we've got another good question from Caroline, who is
Okay.
wondering, how do you cross between the two worlds of astronomy and astrology, science and religion?
Aha. So, for me, there isn't any kind of a contradiction between them, but I have to pay attention to the audience that I'm speaking to. Zoom environments are very difficult because not only can I not see everybody, I can't feel the space. Sometimes you can feel whether, did it go too far? Is this going to fit? Does it work to go there? And it's not about withholding information, but also you just don't want to lay in front of people that are not asking for it information that they're not seeking, whether it's scientific or religious, astrological or astronomical. It's like, where are we all going to land? And how can we become, for me, it's like, how can I become cosmopolitan in my view so that I'm not holding to my own idea? But what informs me in doing this kind of work is the thought that I need to be very aware of what I believe. Because if I'm not aware of what I believe, then I might try to convince somebody of an idea that I myself am seeking to understand. So when I do this work, it's out of a very clear, for me, a very clear sense of what I believe to be the true nature of being. And I'm happy to share with you what that is, but I don't know if that's the question you were asking me. Um, but I have a certain idea about what that is, and so that's why I go about it the way I do. Yeah,
Definitely. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your answer.
yeah,
Um, yeah, we just had, and I see James Rock is on today, or he might have
yeah. Hello,
left.
James.
But he was speaking last night, and it was an amazing talk. And it's really interesting to just understand how important, and it doesn't matter kind of who you are, how important the skies and the stars are in the history of who we are as a people.
Mhm.
Um, and it's interesting to hear so many stories that connect us to the sky. So we're just very, very glad to have you here and
Yeah.
have you talking about the night sky, especially as we think about kind of where we head in the future with our lights and kind of thinking about how we can control those
Yeah.
and think about correct lighting and what is correct lighting and what does that mean. So
Yeah, I appreciate your saying that, and I think what I would offer to that is that my approach has been, because I'm not suited to writing lighting ordinances, and doing that more technical kind of stuff. I'm more suited to storytelling, and I believe very strongly that the more we can awaken that organic sense of connection that comes to us out of every culture around the world throughout all time, the more we can stay connected to that, the greater will be the possibility of our making good choices. I believe. I believe. So it's like I'll stand up for the story and I'll do that part. And so it's interesting the environments that I get called into to talk, because I feel like, well, I'm just going to give you the once upon a time, but it is going to end in a happily ever after. And we need that. We need that kind of soul nourishment day after day after day, particularly when things get really challenging. And it's not that, former people just had this wild, naive idea. They didn't realize how bad the world was. It was that they understood that when things get hard, humanity needs to be supported, and happily ever after can do a lot to help us get through really challenging times.
mhm,
And beautiful
definitely.
night skies, beautiful night skies restore the soul. We need
Yeah,
that.
definitely. Well, thank you again. It looks like we don't have too many more questions at the moment, but um, yeah, thank you so much for joining us tonight. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks for everything that you folks are doing over there. Wow, what a list of supporters you had at the beginning. I was like, man, it's going on and on. So thank you to all your supporters and to the community that showed up, and can't wait to come to Duluth again.
Definitely.
Definitely.
We'll be happy to have you. So
Yes.
Thanks so
Thank
much.
you so much.
mhm.
Thank you.
you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Mary Stewart Adams.
Thank you, Cynthia. So good to hear your voice.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Mary. Jim Rock, thank you.
Hey, good to hear you, Jim. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye, Randy. Bye-bye.
Great talk. Thanks.